Okay, welcome back to Unit 4, and in the design concept part of Unit 4, we're going to be covering the issues of scale, and then some related issues, portion, and then also hierarchy. We'll be talking about hierarchical scale, and then that will also relate to talking about hierarchy and emphasis a little bit. We'll cover hierarchy and emphasis again at another point in the class, but we will cover it a little bit here. And so if you, as a quick recap, so far in this unit, the art historical information was on early Christian art of the late Roman Empire all the way up to the Gothic. And then the art medium that we discussed, kind of that came naturally out of that, was architecture. And so obviously when we've been looking at a lot of architecture, we've been looking at a lot of large scale art. Architecture automatically by its nature is art at a scale bigger than the size of a person, sometimes quite large. And so, and scale is a major part of the effect, the way a vaulting roof goes upward creates a sense of uplift has a lot to do with its scale, and that scale has a lot to do with its impact. So first thing we're going to be talking about is monumental scale. And so let's go back to some of the very earliest work we looked at that was of monumental scale. Here are the pyramids of Giza. 3 different pyramids, each for a different pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. This one here is Khufu or Khafra, depending on which spelling and pronunciation you go with. And I have a couple of points I just want to make out. One, I want to just really emphasize how very few of these pictures really communicate the size and the scale of this. Like when you look at this picture here, even with these people in front of it, it doesn't look all that big. But then when you see this, you see people sitting on the stones, right, at this scale, and how big the stone, each one of these stones is, it gives you a much greater sense of the just mind-bogglingly large size of these pyramids. But then at the same time, pyramid or scale is perceived in space. And so it's always confusing. Like something really large, if viewed from a long distance away, doesn't necessarily look all that large. But then at the same time, something really large, when you get up close, you can't see the whole thing. So you also don't have a great sense of how large it is. So perception and proportion and distance and perspective can have a big impact on scale. And so let's talk more about kind of monumental scale and some examples. And as I was doing research on monumental scale, of course, I was already also doing research on the colossal head of Constantine, and I was running across these colossal heads from Olmec culture, which is in Latin America, Mexico, and around Nicaragua, Guatemala. And they are amazing pieces of sculpture. There's a difference, though, in that between these two and versus the Constantine head. The Constantine head was made to go on a larger piece of figure of a colossus that stood, a colossus version of Constantine, whereas these colossal heads were made to be just there, just heads on their own, which I think in some ways is more impressive, something just scary about this giant floating head. Well, not floating, but placed. And here are 2 examples of some contemporary artists who use monumental scale for effect. Especially for Sobodgutta, the the scale of this installation, the sense of the installation pouring in on you from these rooms, the kind of the created impression that the rooms on the other sides of these passageways are completely filled with this debris. The scale of that is a huge part of it. It's a ginormous scale, but then a sense of like invading your space at that scale. Whereas I think the oval Buddha piece is definitely quite impressive because of the scale, but it's yet it's also a little bit more restrained. I mean, maybe part of that is the space it's placed in. Like if it was in an interior space, it would probably feel a little bit more overwhelming. A point I want to make about scale, and especially about monumental scale, is that in big scales they have to be experienced through space, like in space and through space. You have to go through them. So like we already talked a little bit about Richard Serra's pieces for the Guggenheim Bilboa, which by the way is a Frank Gehry building, if you remember from our last lecture, right? So inside that Frank Gehry building is these pieces of art, right, of sculpture. And they function in some ways very much similar to the aesthetic of the architecture, which is of this getting you to sort of enter these spaces and wander through them, and this meandering. And you can't really experience these pieces without walking through them. Or here's another example, this Richard Long piece, which is this piece is a single line made by one person walking back and forth along this line. I'm not exactly sure what kind of technology he had to do, because I think that this line is about maybe 2 miles or so from this point to that point, maybe more, and how he managed to keep it so perfectly straight. But still, you can see a photograph of the piece, but to really comprehend it, you'd have to experience it the same way he did. And then another point I want to make, and this is especially true about monumental scale, but also quite true sometimes about intimate scale, like small scale objects, which is that scale is relative. And that, and here's a good example. We have reconstructions of the statue of Athena that would have been in the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena. And from all the reconstructions, she would have towered in this space. She would have been quite a large piece of sculpture, maybe 30 feet all the way to the top. But more importantly, she would have just barely fit inside the space. So her being kind of tightly compressed within the space of the Parthenon is part of the effect, right? That it's not just that she's a giant, she's ginormous to and constrained by this space, and that makes her feel even larger. Here's another issue about relative scale, which is that sometimes, especially in sculpture, but in a lot of different art, mediums, artists will play with issues of proportion and scale for the purposes of proper perception, right? When sculptors are putting pieces of sculpture on the tops of buildings high up, they have to overcarve, as you would say. They have to overcarve the piece, making, like, let's say, the eye sockets even deeper to create even more deep shadows, making certain features stronger, right? And the same you can see in the decisions that Michelangelo made about David here, right? Because he knew that, I mean, David was going to be on a pedestal, and David was going to be a pretty large sculpture at that. So at the top height, I do believe his eyes are about at 18 feet up. So it's quite high above. So for us to see it clearly when we're walking up to it, he needs to kind of overcarve and over-exaggerate the depth and the clarity of the features, right? And even the scale, the proportional scale of the features, in order to make the figure readable from that angle and from that distance. So here's another issue, which is that there are definitely examples of artists who are making work about monumental scale, but not doing it physically at monumental scale. So here are two works by Goya. One is an etching and one's painting, but they're both pretty small. I think the painting is maybe, I don't know, maybe somewhere around 2 feet at the largest dimension. And oop, that's my 1 minute warning. So this, I guess, will be a two-parter. And then here we have the etching, which is even smaller. And in both of them, though, he does a great job of creating the illusion of how large the thing that's supposed to be giant in it is. I think you can also see the same thing in the NC Wyeth. Since I have like maybe a couple of seconds, I'll just say this one thing. This painting was painted for a cafeteria in a boarding school. A parent had a child die, and they asked NC Wyeth as a memorial to create this painting. And I think it's just such a great work of art. Okay, I'll speak to you the next part.